Hello and welcome to my Hot Topics presentation on the subject of sustainable, equitable and resilient cities. My name is Anna Hawkins and I'm an environmental social scientist here at Sheffield Hallam University. My main teaching and research interests are really around sustainable and equitable consumption of resources. So this is about looking at the patterns of everyday life to understand how they've become so resource intensive and thinking about how we can change that. But importantly, making a distinction between people who are already consuming very little because they're either very excluded or on very low incomes, and people who are maybe in a better position to equitably change their consumption. So some people consume a lot and some people don't consume very much. And we have to talk to those people differently when we're thinking about what needs to change and who needs to change. Why I am talking about cities today, before I get into some of the kind of key ideas around sustainability, equity and resilience, make the case for why I'm talking about cities. Cities are where most people on the planet already live. So 55% of the population already live in cities, and this figure is likely to increase. What this means is that we are an urbanizing species. More and more people on the planet are gathering together and living in cities in larger and larger numbers. And cities are very resource intensive places. At the moment, they consume over 60% of global energy and they produce over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that takes into account not only what happens within those cities, but all of the resources that people living in cities require to live. So things that are produced outside of cities but are consumed within them. Both within cities and between cities around the world, there is huge inequality in terms of the quality of life that is enjoyed by people within those cities. That can be related purely to levels of income, but there are huge inequalities in terms of the way that poor quality environments affect people's health, in terms of the kind of work that people are able to do, in terms of the levels of mental and physical well-being that people are able to obtain in cities. And I believe that if we want to meet our global environmental challenges, we have to think about how we can live differently in cities, and we have to think about that in terms of how all people within cities can live good lives. There are three important terms I just need to very quickly talk about before we get into the rest of the presentation, and that is the terms sustainability, equity, and resilience. To explain these concepts, I've used this diagram here, which shows the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but rearranged to represent this idea of nested sustainability. What this really recognises is that we have something called a planetary limit, and you may have heard that term before, but really that's about the carrying capacity of the planet, how much resource the planet can produce, and how many people it can kind of handle in terms of the amount of waste that's produced and the amount of energy that is required for people to live. And this really changes depending upon so the carrying capacity of the Earth is very much related to how much people on the Earth consume at the moment. And there's huge inequality in terms of resource consumption at the moment. So it's not easy just to say this is how many people could live on the planet. It very much depends how those people are living on the planet. But we have this idea of a biosphere, a carrying capacity, a planetary limit. And within that sits human society. And there's lots of sustainable development goals that relate to that society. And within that society sits our economy. And the reason for this diagram showing this kind of hierarchy really is to rebalance this idea that in order to achieve sustainability, we need to have equal balance between the economy, the environment, and society. What this is reminding us is that without a healthy and functioning planet and biosphere, there is no society. And without a healthy, functioning society, there is no economy. So actually, rather than these being three equally balanced terms, there is a hierarchy. And if we're going to prioritize our efforts, we need to make sure that we, first of all, support a healthy biosphere. Cities also need to think about this idea of a just transition, and this is really about this idea of equity. So rather than proposing changes that say, for example, at the moment, there's lots of talk about people moving to electric vehicles rather than vehicles that are powered by petrol and diesel. This sounds like a really good idea, and there's certainly lots of benefits to it. But for a start, it really privileges people that can afford to buy into that technology in the first place. And there are lots of people on lower incomes who couldn't make that transition. But also, we need to think about the materials that are used in electric vehicles and where those materials come from. And in particular, things like lithium for the batteries in electric vehicles that are mined far away from most of the cities where we're talking about making these kind of transitions to electric vehicles. What does a transition to electric vehicles mean in terms of everyone within a particular city being able to benefit from that? And what does it mean in terms of the environmental impact of that transition, in terms of the amount of lithium, just for one example, that needs to be mined and produced? So this is that idea really of equity, making sure that we don't just think about what we want to do or what we're able to do in more privileged parts of the world. We think about how that impacts upon all populations around the world. The final term, resilience, really recognises that cities are actually very vulnerable. They may feel very powerful, but they are very vulnerable to changes in terms of things like weather events, in terms of things like supply chain changes, in terms of things like resource depletion and water management. So cities feel powerful, but actually at the moment they can be disrupted enormously by weather events or by supply chain disruptions. And it was thinking about how you can restructure cities so that they are less vulnerable and are able to recover and adapt more easily. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be introducing some circular ideas to you. And these are some theories around urban sustainability that have been circling, if you'll excuse the pun, for quite a while now. But they're really interesting ideas, and they kind of underpin some practical examples for how you could think about developing more sustainable, equitable, and resilient cities of the future. And they are donut economics, the idea of circular cities, and a healthy urban ecosystem. First of all, donut economics. You may not think that you're particularly interested or excited about economics, but I would ask you to bear with me on this one. This is a really interesting idea that was developed by economist Kate Raworth, and there are links to some resources at the end of this presentation if you want to read into this more. But this economic model is really interesting for me because it recognises this concept of planetary limits. In this model, it's referred to as an ecological ceiling, but it's really the same kind of idea that if we go beyond certain limits, then we start to have problematic climate change. We start to deplete the ozone layer. We start to have unmanageable levels of air pollution or dangerous levels of air pollution. We start to poison our fresh water and limit the fresh water that's available, etc. You can read more about that if you want to. So it's at the moment, our economic model seems to think that we can carry on producing and consuming limitlessly. It doesn't take into account this idea of an ecological ceiling. The other side of the donut, the inner ring of the donut, is called the social foundation. And this is really relating to this idea of equity. It's basically saying that no matter what we do, we should not have people who are falling below this social foundation. We should be able to make sure that everyone has access to clean water, adequate food, reasonable levels of health, education, that they feel engaged and involved in their local cities or in their local societies, that we don't have problematic social inequality, gender inequality, people have access to good quality housing and access to sustainable and adequate energy. These two bounding concepts are really important. It's basically saying that there is a space within this ring donut where we can have safe space where people are living a reasonable quality of life, but we stay within our planetary limits. So that as an idea is something that I want you to kind of think about, and we're going to take it through to the next circle, which is the circular city. So the idea of donut economics is a big idea that kind of changes the way that we think about the logic of the economic model that we live by. So rather than thinking that there are that it's limitless amounts of stuff out there that we can consume and waste, it starts to place planetary limits on that. But in terms of how we adapt that big idea to thinking about cities, there is something now that's called the city portrait, that the donut economics people have applied this kind of scaled down model so we can start to apply that big idea to the way that we think about planning and developing cities. And it recognises that cities have a global impact. And in order to think about developing cities in a more equitable and sustainable way, we need to start asking these questions. So we have 4 questions here that guide the process of applying donut economic models to cities. One is, what would it mean for people of this city to thrive? And this is really about how we keep people within the city, within that, above that social foundation limit. But also, importantly, what would it mean for this city to respect the well-being of people worldwide? In other words, if we're doing things within this city that have a negative impact on populations elsewhere, then that would mean that we were not being true to this model of the donut. The ecological questions we could ask are, what would it mean for this city to thrive within its natural habitat? But also, what would it mean for this city to respect the health of the whole planet? These are really interesting questions. They have huge implications for how you might think about making decisions within a city. And they fundamentally change the way that we assume the power of cities as limitless consumers of resources and producers of waste. How, though, do we start to answer some of those questions? How do we actually start to practically change the way that we function in cities in order to become more sustainable? The next circle helps us to start to answer that question. So if we're going to think about making cities less resource intensive, then we need to think differently about how we consume within cities. And we need to think differently about the structure of urban lifestyles in order to do that. Recognizing particularly that we currently do not consume food, water, energy, or materials in a sustainable way. Circular cities it's a body of ideas, and again there's a link to resources on this at the end of this presentation that will help you explore this in more detail if you're interested. But this is really about thinking differently about how we structure our economy. So let me show you the 2 different models that are contrasted here. At the moment, we operate in what's called a linear economy, and that could sometimes be summarized as a take, make, waste, or in this case, take, make, use, dispose model. So we extract resources from the planet, we grow crops, or we mine resources, or we take things from the planet, we process those and make them into consumable resources. We use them, and then we produce waste. And we can think about that as both materials and also energy and water. What would happen in terms of moving to a circular economy or a circular city model will be that we closed up that loop. So rather than seeing waste at the end of it and fresh resources at the beginning of it, we close the loop up so that we rather than throw things away, we collect and transform that formerly what we would consider waste, and actually make it into new products and reuse it. And that can happen in terms of capturing wastewater, capturing and waste energy, waste heat from processes, and reusing everything from food waste through to material resources and transforming them into new uses. The circular economy has lots of examples in practice already, and you can read more about that following some of the sources at the end of this presentation. But one of the important things to remember with the circular economy is that it's lots and lots of small examples that would quite fundamentally transform the way that we do things every day. And this kind of leads us to this idea of the healthy urban ecosystem. So in cities of the future, one of the things that we're going to be thinking about is bringing back nature to cities, to grow food, to reduce flood risk, to recycle nutrients, to keep cities cool, to keep the urban populations healthy and to keep ourselves happy. So the idea of a healthy urban ecosystem, again, ecosystems really suggest circles. They're very circular. They're all about how we have resource use and energy production and reusing that energy and reusing those resources within the closed loop of the city. And this is important in terms of starting to minimize the amount that we need to extract from the planet and vastly reducing the amount of waste and harmful pollutants that we produce. It will also mean, as more and more of us live in cities, that we need to share our space differently. We need to travel between places differently. We need to use different forms of transport, minimize the amount of individual cars that we use. It's also going to mean that we need to prioritize our time differently. If you imagine already things like moving to a circular economy, that would mean just the process of throwing something in the bin would become obsolete. We would start to think about all the things that we currently think about as waste as a resource that's going to be reused. And if you think about how awkward and complicated it can be sometimes to manage recycling at home, if you think about scaling that up so that nothing gets thrown away, nothing gets put into landfill, then that's going to take time and space. It's also going to mean that we consume less. We buy fewer products. We expect to have fewer products in our lives. We move around differently so that we don't all expect to have our own car and to be driven everywhere, that we use public transport differently, that we walk and cycle and use scooters to get around more often than we would expect to drive. So it does suggest some very fundamental changes to the design and function of lives within cities. But what is exciting for me is that those ideas are already out there, and they're being tested in living labs in cities around the world. We're trialing different ways of living. We're trialing different ways of designing cities so that they mimic nature, so that they reduce the amount of resources that are consumed, so that they reduce the amount of energy that's consumed, but also that they improve the quality of life, the mental and physical health of people living in cities. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you again.